Thank you, Bob. That was very interesting. My name is Bill Spikowski. I'm a planning consultant from Southwest Florida. I live in Fort Myers, and I'm incredibly envious about what Southeast Florida is doing. We really need it on the Southwest coast, and I'm very happy to be here to help you formulate the vision for Southeast. So we've just heard a lot of really interesting information, and it's very important for all of you who are the delegates helping formulate this new plan to understand what these trends are. And but another question is how is this information, these numbers and this data used in the planning process beyond helping formulate the vision? What about informing the general public about the reasons for the vision, what's behind it, and over time how we understand whether we're making progress in that direction or not. And so there's a lot of history that we can look back to see how data and numbers have been used in regional plans and visions. The first golden age of regional planning that Victor mentioned a little bit earlier was in New York in the 1920s, and they, without the kind of computing technology we have now, created incredible graphics that help communicate the New York City regional planning issues. This particular one is a simple map in the plan that shows passenger rail connections coming in and out of Manhattan. And the width of those lines is the number of trains per day. And in one quick view, the data that would cover pages of tables was communicated to the public to let them know the situation and the reason for the various changes that were proposed. Also in the same plan, the city of New York had a terrible water pollution problem at that point, and the dark bars you see along the waterfront, these are the areas where the water was so polluted it was condemned by the Board of Health, and the lighter lines show lesser aspects of pollution. This communicated the regional scope of the problem and the need for regional solutions to them. At the same time, in the 1920s, Los Angeles County was dealing with what New York had dealt with quite a few decades earlier. It's a water supply for such a concentration of people. And in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Regional Plan was the investment plan for a permanent water supply for all of Los Angeles County. Involved trapping water in the mountains, keeping it pure, and transferring it down. This was done through a regional vision and communicated very well to the general public. You heard earlier that this is an investment plan that we're working on here. A lot of the investments are things that can be decided by the people of Southeast Florida. Even though a lot of our transportation money ends up coming from Tallahassee through the metropolitan planning organizations, a lot of that is controlled by agencies and people in this region if we can get together and decide how those investments should be done. This is not something that really should be deferred to the professional planners or the transportation planners. These investments affect the layout and the comfort and the convenience and the prosperity of our entire community. And how that investment money is spent by public and private sector will have a huge impact. Obviously, the mass transit is very expensive, but highways are very expensive as well. These are decisions that can and should be made locally. Regrettably, some of the other decisions aren't about things that we have the same kind of control over. The climate change issues that are affecting the entire world, but apparently having a rather disproportionate effect on the East Coast of the United States due to accidents of geography, are something that we don't decide whether this should happen, we decide how to respond to it. Now, one of the problems in communicating this with the general public is that the scientific uncertainty about the amount of sea level rise. And so this is a map that's gotten wide circulation that shows what would be inundated in Southeast Florida if there was a 1 meter rise in sea level. Well, that's pretty terrifying, and it's very hard for anybody to judge, except the scientists who work on this field, to judge whether that's at all realistic for us. And we don't really have to communicate with the public with a doomsday scenario here. In fact, we have tools now where in the last 4 or 5 years that give us the ability to show the public, show ourselves, show elected officials the effects of varying amounts of sea level rise over time. The LIDAR sensing, this kind of image is taken by a single airplane pass with a LiDAR sensor. And this can be processed in the computer. Those are the houses along the beach, in the front and the middle. They can cut those off. The trees in the back can be cut off, and we get great topographic maps that show with more accuracy than we ever had the topography of the entire region. That lets us know if there was a 6-inch rise in sea level, what the impacts would be, a foot and a half, and 2 feet. We don't need to agree on the amount because it's rather unknowable, but we can certainly understand the implications. In data, we also have, through traditional sources like the census and a lot of additional work done by the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, the ability to understand the locational, the effects of placing new residences in different parts of the region. And in this particular map, the darkest areas show when people live in the darkest areas, they're going to drive a lot more because the jobs and a lot of the recreation, educational institutions are not in those areas. So this is based on the census, and it's being updated now for the new census. So we really know, in a way we maybe thought we knew before, the effects on vehicle miles traveled, and therefore road investment, and therefore impact on families for how much money they're going to have to spend on transportation. Now, there's a couple ways that this kind of data is typically communicated with the public. One are called indicators, and these are sort of simplified measurements that let people understand the direction of change over time. And another is called benchmarks, which are targets. These are set by policy rather than by data, that let us use the indicators over time, again, to see whether we're moving closer to the goals we're trying to get to, indicators and benchmarks. And these have been used in a number of recent regional plans and visions. I'll just mention a few of them today. In the state of Texas, Central Texas, in the Austin region, there's a 5-county regional planning effort that's been going on for a number of years, and in fact being expanded now through the same Sustainable Communities program that's helping the 750 plan. 5-county regional plan, but this was actually preceded by a very sophisticated indicators project where there is a scorecard published every 2 years. This is a snapshot of it. And in this scorecard, each of the indicators is actually, in a simplified way, lets the public understand which of these are getting better, which are getting worse, and which are staying the same. That's the Austin region and the 5 counties surrounding it. Moving up to the state of Maryland. Maryland's a state, but it's actually of a size smaller than some regions. Its government is complicated because it's affected by the surrounding states greatly and by Washington, D.C. And Maryland has had an ongoing regional planning project over the last 4 or 5 years that's done a lot of the things we will be doing here. It began with citizen input on the sense of the public, on the educated, informed public on what would be a better way to grow. But what they did next was of particular interest for us today. They said after that was done, okay, that's what we'd like to happen, but what if other things happen in the outer economy and society that might not make that possible? What if energy prices rise, gas to $5 to $8 per gallon? Is that regional scenario now impractical, or is it now more important than ever? And something particular to that particular region is, what if the federal government expenditures go up and down? It's so affected by the government employment that again could make the general consensus vision. And so they have pioneered techniques in Maryland for creating what they call contingent plans. If certain things happen from the outside, how would we adjust this sort of regional consensus? How should it be adjusted in the future? Finally, getting back to Florida, we've been part of the rebirth, the second great rebirth of regional planning here. And there's some very interesting things have been happening around the state, some not as widely publicized as you might think, given their importance to the state. Many of you will know about 5 or 6 years ago, the 1,000 Friends of Florida basically took the state as it existed in 2005 and identified which areas were developed, which are in the pink areas and the permanently preserved in green, and said, what will happen by the year 2060 given continued growth at the rates that were officially projected at the time, not as high today given what's happened since. And they actually created a very systematic and defensible and credible way what would happen, what the state would look like in the year 2060. So that's if we do nothing, what would happen by the year 2060? Well, the second and more interesting part of that was done, work was done by the University of Central Florida with help from the University of Pennsylvania. And they said, okay, that's what's going to happen if we don't make any change. What could happen over 2060 if we're accommodating the same population with a different view? What if instead of continuing to build highways, we put that investment into high-speed rail and mass transit at each stop? What would happen? How would that change the growth pattern to accommodate the same number of people? It's just a phenomenal difference. And although everybody says, well, that rail would be terribly expensive, the highway expansion is terribly expensive too as you expand further and further into new territory. And by the projections of this plan, it actually be less expensive with the mass transit option. So we have another example of the use of technical data to support or defeat various hypotheses on how our growth should take place. For those of you who are interested in this topic, let me say one more thing. An addition that wasn't done in this alternate Florida project but should be done is following the Maryland model that says, what if some of these things change? And one is energy prices, which would be pretty much the same as in Maryland. But we have some of our own. We're not so concerned about the federal government expenditures, but certainly after listening to Bob Burchell the last 20 minutes, the migration of people to and from Florida would have an astounding impact on the future, our future. Bob has made a number of very interesting projections, but we can actually create contingent plans that say, but if those don't come true, how might we adjust this vision over time based on something we learned 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And of course, the sea level rise, does that, again, endorse the hypothesis of a better way to grow, or does it make parts of it impossible if sea level rise is higher than currently projected? For those of you who are interested in this particular topic, I've just touched on 3 of the case studies. We're publishing a report that will be available shortly on the 750 website that looks at a dozen regional plans and visions of great note with regard to how they use data, how that's communicated to the public, how it's used to help formulate the plan. And those of you interested, please read that, and we welcome any comments on it. Send them, please, to the South Florida Regional Partnership. Thank you.